Matthew chapter 4, verse 18. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across Jordan followed him. All right, the first calling of the disciples. Any comments on this?
Is it literally that Jesus called them and they just followed him, or is there some background to it that they heard about him and they were sort of prepared for it, or was it a spontaneous reaction to his call?
Well, the way Matthew describes it, it looks pretty spontaneous. Even when Matthew describes his own calling, Jesus sees him at the place where he's exchanging tax money and tells him to come follow him, and he follows. John gives a description, and we, in a sense, I guess we don't know if what John describes in chapter 1 of the Gospel of John is before or after what Matthew is describing, because it is different. It's not the same. So in the Gospel of John, Andrew calls Peter to come see Jesus. And Jesus says, "You are Simon, but I'll call you Peter." And he does something similar when Philip brings Nathanael. Here is an Israelite in whom there is no guile. So did that happen before Jesus called them from fishing and they left their nets and followed him? Or did it happen after? I don't know. Just don't know. Obviously they would have heard of Jesus. It's not like this is the first thing he ever did. But it does seem like there's just something very compelling about his invitation.
If we were to look at the ages of Jesus. So Jesus was about 30 years then, because it's the beginning of his ministry. So maybe his to-be disciples were also of the same age and early part of their careers or their profession or their job. So it was so much more difficult for them to leave, or easy for them to leave whatever their professions were. May have been difficult, is what I think.
I think for all of them, even for all of us, what is it that we're called to do? I feel like that's something that's worth talking about. Has anybody felt that they have a particular calling on your life that isn't necessarily what your job is?
Not really. Sometimes I felt that, am I doing anything for God? And especially when I see evangelists and people who make a lot of sacrifices for, talking to people about the gospel. But then somewhere along the way, I seem to hear a voice that says, wherever you are, you have to practice the gospel, and you have to practice Christian values. And I think that way, that's the thing that comes to me. But sometimes, yes, I do feel that, I don't do enough, if that's anything. Yeah.
That sounds like a calling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think the opportunities that I have to take actions or to manifest certain behaviors, I think is a calling. I work in a very secular organization, so sensitive to or respect to the other, respect to cultures, respect to beliefs, but never to say it in the open or the public. So it's so very personal and private. So that way, you cannot talk about religion and belief, but then I think it's the behaviors that others see in you, which I think is a witness. Where we, as Christians, we stand apart from the others, and I think that's a marked difference.
Yeah, I feel especially in places like India that may be the most important kind of evangelism.
How would you define a calling?
I don't know, Prema, do you have a definition?
No, I don't. That's the problem. It always seems to be something special, but I guess it needn't always be so.
Anything that you feel strongly about, something you really want to do?
Okay, yeah.
Always,
Go ahead, Prema.
no, one doesn't always have that feeling.
Any other comments? One of the things that I think is really clear and repeated in the Bible is the idea that each one of us has a calling and an election that has been placed on our lives since before the foundation of the world. In other words, God chose us. So whether we feel some kind of special calling or not, it seems to me, feelings aside, the Bible teaches that we're called. So whether or not that means, you have to be an evangelist or a pastor or a teacher or whatever, that I don't know. Paul seems to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, concerning the gifts of the Spirit, that we are, all of us, we're the body of Christ. And to each one is given a manifestation of the Spirit that all might benefit. In other words, he makes his own list. He says some have gifts of healings, some have gifts of healing, some prophecies, some speaking in tongues, some interpretation of tongues. And then in chapter 13, he says, but I'll show you the most excellent way. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, if I don't have love, I'm just a sounding gong or a tinkling cymbal. And he goes on and talks about how love is the most excellent way. So it seems to me there are some people, like Paul describes in another passage in Romans, who have gifts of leadership, some who have gifts of administration, some who have gifts of generosity, some who have gifts of humility. And each one of us is called of God to function within his body based on the gifts that he gives to us. we just, there's a gift of hospitality. I feel like there's some people in this group that have the gift of hospitality. So we're simply called to use that so that people are blessed and drawn into a relationship with God through the gifts that he's given to us. So you may not have a gift of evangelism, but that doesn't mean you're not going to be drawing people to Christ through, Sajjan, what you're talking about, just living like a follower of Jesus on a daily basis in a secular job. Prema, I think you have the gift of hospitality, whether or not you think you do or not. I think everybody who knows you thinks that you do. You probably have other gifts I don't know about. Or maybe you have a sense of something that you just really love to do. It's quite possible that God placed that in your heart. I think that seeking a relationship with God that is such that if he urges you in a particular direction, you're sensitive to that and you're obedient. Like if you're in that situation, before we moved here and I began teaching at Bible college, I always had secular jobs that I did while I was doing the ministry. One of those jobs, I was working in to use the same phrases you just said, a very secular environment. And I remember we actually had a break. We didn't actually take breaks that often, but it was a very busy time around Christmas time when it was in that company, it was very, very tense. And so the entire building shut down for like 10 or 15 minutes so that everybody could just take a break. And it was one of the rare times in that job where we were all sitting around together, this team that we worked with. We were usually so busy we hardly even talked. And one of them brought up the subject of some television evangelists who had been caught in some kind of scandal at that time. And my boss said, yeah, Christians, they're all just fakes. There's nothing real about what they're doing. And I said, I'm a Christian. And, there was silence around the whole group. Because I think nobody, including my boss, knew what to say to that. But, I wasn't going to just accept what he was saying, because I know that the example that those television evangelists were giving was a horrible example. That's not what Christianity is about. So I felt that was one of those opportunities to, in a secular environment, take a stand for what Jesus was doing in my life. And the truth is that I did not lead anybody in that group to say the sinner's prayer or anything like that. I don't know if that had any kind of positive impact on anybody in that group. But we're called to be witnesses, to give testimony to what God is doing in our lives, whatever the situation is. So whatever work we're doing, he's placed us where we are as a calling, whether that's working at home or these days working online. Whenever we're interacting with people, we are representing Jesus in one way or another. Any other comments on this? In other words, I think Jesus is calling every one of us to follow him. It's not just the 12 that he called. And obviously you can read through the notes. Okay. In my notes, that seems to be the end. Is that the end of chapter 14, verse 25?
Yes, verse 25, yes.
Yep. To me, the whole point of that ending portion of the chapter is everybody that met Jesus was transformed by the meeting, the encounter. And I feel that we should expect that that's going to happen with us as well. And as a result of that, we become followers of him. And as followers of him, we are also called to have that same kind of impact on the people who are around us. All right. Matthew chapter 5. Obviously, I've given a message here. It's small. And begin with the inauguration of the kingdom of Israel when Saul was inaugurated as king. And he disobeyed something that God had directly told him to do. And the prophet Samuel comes to him and says, when you were small in your own eyes, basically what he says is, when you were small in your own eyes, the whole country was better off. But when he kind of took things into his own hands, he was a horror to everybody who was around him. So Jesus, seeing the multitudes like they are sheep without a shepherd, he called his disciples to himself and he began to teach them. So seeing the needs of the multitudes, he begins to teach his disciples, because it's the disciples who are called to meet the needs of the multitudes. And he tells them, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Just give me a second. I'll go ahead and use the PowerPoint. You all can see the PowerPoint, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So small, it's just easy to remember. And you may have figured out, those of you who read the notes, it may seem a little bit convoluted because it's like there's a message on the Sermon on the Mount, and then there's another message on the Sermon on the Mount. I think there are actually 3. And that's actually intentional. So hopefully it won't get too repetitive as we go through this material. Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. what is meant by that? Any comments on it? The poor in spirit, what do you think of when you think of that?
Like ungenerous, sort of selfish, not thinking of others.
Oh, nice.
I also thought poor, they have low self-esteem.
Okay. All right. If we're thinking of poor in spirit, person who has a poor spirit, we may look at it from a Christian perspective and think of people who are ungenerous as being poor in spirit. But this is saying the people who are poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I think the way that I would describe this, and for the purposes of this particular way of looking at the Sermon on the Mount, people who are small in their own eyes, who are not trying to be big. They don't think of themselves as being a Mahatma. Instead, they think of themselves as being small.
Actually, in this context, that's what goes best.
Yeah. You all recognize this.
Mustard seed.
Yeah. See, Jesus said, if you have just the faith of the mustard seed is small. Zechariah chapter 4, the prophet said to the people who are trying to rebuild Israel, do not despise the days of small things. It's immediately after that that God says to the leaders of Israel, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. Jesus said, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be thrown into the sea, and it will throw itself into the sea. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus gives the parables of the kingdom. He says that the kingdom is like a seed that is planted. It grows up, and the ones that are bearing fruit, they bear 30, 60, 100-fold. John chapter 12, Jesus said, just before his crucifixion, unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So I think the idea of being small or poor in spirit is this idea of just recognizing, you don't have to make a big contribution. You don't have to make a big splash. You don't have to be world famous or, have some kind of huge impact on the world in order to be obedient to God and do what he's called you to do. It's actually smallness. It's the humble that are going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. People who are small in their own eyes. 2 is meek. Blessed are those who are meek, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Do you recognize this guy? Dwayne Johnson?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The rock.
Yeah. He's about an inch taller than me, but he weighs 60 pounds more, like 20, almost 30 kgs heavier, but he's no fat. He's huge. That's his daughter, Jasmine. So when Dwayne Johnson goes for a walk with his daughter, Jasmine, that is more of a biblical perspective of what it means to be meek. The term that is used for meek in Greek does not mean weak at all. Actually, it's just the opposite. It means it was used of a racehorse that had been tamed in such a way that it was able to use its strength to win races. That was called a meek horse. So blessed are the meek, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy.
Ken, you missed mourn. Blessed are those who mourn.
I'm not finished. Yeah, we'll get there. It's just I'm going with, so you have SMAT.
Oh, like that. Okay, sorry.
It's not your fault. I've kind of restructured the.
Okay.
So it all fits into small.
Mhm.
We might, I feel like when we seek after justice, we try to use the power of the court on our favor. When we are in a position of being able to punish or to show mercy, whenever it's possible, we should, as much as we can, show mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. When Jesus taught his people how to pray, he said, forgive. If you don't forgive, you won't be forgiven. Forgive me for reading my own notes, but hurt people hurt people. Each of us has been hurt by others, and we can use our words, our power, our authority, our position, social media or manipulations to hurt back. Mercy leads to and requires forgiveness. And Matthew 18, we all know we're going to get there in a few chapters. Jesus taught the story of a man who owed a great debt, crores of, if you want to put it in rupees, to a king, and he begged the king, please forgive me and I'll pay you back everything. So the king released him, let him go. And that same man who was released by the king, forgiven his huge debt, found a man who owed him 100 rupees, grabbed him by the neck and began to choke him and said, pay me back everything. And he said, have mercy on me and I'll pay you back everything. And the man who was just set free had that man who owed him 100 rupees thrown in prison, debtor's prison. And when the king heard about that, he was furious. He had the man rearrested. He brought him and said, I set you free. Why is it you didn't forgive the one who owed you? And he released the man who owed the previous man the 100 rupees, but he put this man back in jail. So there's a really, really interesting implication in what Jesus is teaching there. God has forgiven our sins, and each one of us owes a debt to him that we could never repay. But we are so prone to be unforgiving to people who've hurt us. But what Jesus seems to be teaching is that when I refuse to forgive the person who has hurt me, I end up being placed in prison. And the person that I won't forgive is set free. That's certainly what happened with that man. So the idea of showing mercy is very, very powerful. I think it's, if we're going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, then we have to learn to show mercy. I mean, you would see in the notes, they're there. Corrie ten Boom wrote a wonderful book, The Hiding Place. If you haven't read the book, it's really worth your time. She was in a Nazi concentration camp, and her parents both died. Her sister was, and she, both of them were tortured by one of the guards in that prison. Her sister also eventually died by a fluke of administrative, actually, mistake. She was released from the prison. And when she was released, she thought she didn't even realize that it was real. And she lived to tell the story. So after World War II was finished, she went to various places. She wrote this book about her parents who had hidden Jews in their home. And for that reason, they ended up being killed in the Nazi concentration camps along with the Jews. And she was on a speaking tour concerning this book. And at one particular party, after she was promoting her book, a man with a very heavy German accent introduced himself to her and said, "Oh, you may not recognize me, but I am prison guard that you spoke about in your speech tonight." And he said, "Since that time, I've become a Christian, and I came to ask you to forgive me." And he put out his hand to shake her hand. And in her book, it's a really good, if you haven't read The Hiding Place, you can find it. If you look up The Hiding Place online, if you want to pay for it, you can. Corrie ten Boom died a long time ago, so I think the royalties don't matter. You can also find it online for free. If you just look up hidingplace.pdf, you can get it, you can download it. She said that she could not think of anything that was more repulsive than that man and everything that he represented. But she knew that the Bible commanded that you forgive. And so in obedience to the command, she began to reach out her hand to the man. And the way she described it, she said that as she reached out her hand, the Lord filled her with mercy and forgiveness and grace. And she later said, when he tells us to love our enemies, he gives with the command the love itself. Wonderful story of mercifulness, forgiveness.
Can I
So-
have a question? It says that whatever we do, our acts are like rags for God,
Sure.
in front of God. So if these acts are done, I mean, whatever you read is done in isolation without God, does it mean it has no consequence, no meaning, or it has to be with the grace of God?
Yeah, Roy, that's a really good question. You know, Paul said again in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians that I mentioned just a few minutes back, that though I give everything that I own, and even if I give my body to be burned, if I don't have love, it profits me nothing. So we need to be obedient to what God has commanded us to do. And I think that one of the lessons that we learn from people like Corrie ten Boom is that sometimes the love is not a feeling that we have in our heart. In fact, what we may feel by nature and within our flesh may be repulsion to the person that God has called us to love. But when we are obedient to what God has called us to do, with the obedience, he places his love in our hearts. So there has to be a balance between obedience to God and the feelings. But I think that many times the obedience has to come first and the feelings follow. Love isn't a feeling, it's an activity. So if you have to make a choice between being obedient to the command to be merciful and kind and gracious, or feeling merciful and kind and gracious, if you can't have both, you can't exactly choose to feel good about somebody, but you can choose to be loving. And I feel that when we choose to be loving, we are being obedient to God. And as we do that, he gives us the grace and the love and the mercy and the kindness and all those gifts of the Spirit. The feelings follow. I think many times obedience has to come first. But yeah, it's like what you implied. When we do those things, if I am merciful or kind or gracious so that I can appear to be spiritual, then there's no profit in that. But if I'm doing those things because of my relationship with God, say, Corrie ten Boom, in the description she gives in her book, she says she actually prayed a prayer as she was talking to that man, asking God for grace because she had no desire to forgive him.